Abigail Seasmore has been staring through her kitchen window for so long her coffee has gone stone cold. It's the beech tree in her front yard that has absorbed her so. She finds herself mesmerized by its branches, how gracefully they seem to sway, side to side, like the arms of a wooden giant dancing against the purple backdrop of dawn. The tree moves with a twisted magnificence. It looks all alone at the end of her lot, like a remnant of some enchanted forest plucked from the pages of a fairy tale, only to be plopped down smack dab in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. Abigail lifts her coffee mug to her mouth and takes an absent-minded sip. The drink's unexpected chill only briefly stirs her from her daydream, and soon enough her thoughts drift off again. Off to the place they were before I began this story. Off to her older brother, Brady, and the day his deep, dark shadow cast itself over her head like a wicked specter. Let us join her in that memory. To do so, we must travel back all those years ago to a time before smartphones and social networks, the Arizona Diamondbacks and reality TV. A time when Abigail's older brother was 19 years old and she was only 6. The two siblings had different fathers, both of whom had been long gone for years. Abigail can't recall much about Brady's dad, but she doesn't recall much about her own father either. They, like most of her early memories, have long since washed away down the river of time. Not this one, though. This memory is different. How vividly she can picture it. It's almost as though her life had flashed into existence that warm autumn afternoon, playing in the tall grass which grew in front of her family's 2-story Dutch colonial. With its gambrel roof and its brick chimney and its beige vinyl siding that so poorly mimicked the appearance of wood. Cotton ball clouds hung weightlessly in the sky, and just across the street, wind gusted through Mr. Gracie's cornfield. It sounded like this. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Abigail can envision her mother's face, the solemn expression she wore as the sheriff's brown and white Crown Vic idled to a stop in front of the family's home. She remembers the sheriff well, too. So large he seemed back then, standing well over 6'6", in his hand-stitched black leather cowboy boots that most certainly weren't standard issue. Atop a tuft of graying hair, he wore a white Stetson, and concealing nearly half his face were a pair of mirrored aviators. Their teardrop lenses reflected the sun, scattering bronze rays in a dozen different directions. The sheriff stepped off the street and began to blaze a trail through the tall grass on his way to the porch. He stopped when he spotted young Abigail hiding amongst the weeds, then smiled and tipped his big white hat in her direction before continuing on. But even at 6, she could sense there had been something terribly forced about their exchange. The sheriff had brought an awful aura with him that day. It rose off his body like a black plume of smoke. It stunk of cheap cologne and cigarettes, of old leather boots and Southern comfort. But most of all, it stunk of Brady. He had been missing for 3 days. The sheriff lumbered up to the porch and removed his hat. His hair was a messy knot of silvery twine in the afternoon light. He greeted Abigail's mother with the same forced smile he had used to greet young Abigail, then bowed his head and began to speak. The adults conversed quietly, their voices rising just above a whisper. From the front yard, Abigail could hear nothing of their discussion, only the whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of the warm September breeze blowing through the cornstalks across the street. But she watched them anyway, and as they carried on, she noticed the color drain from her mother's face and the age lines deepen between her brow. Once the sheriff had finished saying his piece, he withdrew down the steps and started back towards his car. He would not stop to tip his hat to Abigail a second time. Perhaps he knew such a courtesy would have been an empty gesture. It would make sense, considering his reason for being there in the first place. Or perhaps he could see a bit of Brady in Abigail's face. That would make sense, too. Abigail's brother had been found, but he would not be coming home. No, Brady would instead remain in the sheriff's custody until he could be transferred to the county jail. There would be no bail. Monsters seldom receive such luxuries, and Abigail's brother was indeed a monster, one that had just gone on the most violent killing spree Pike County, Indiana had ever seen. Okay, we're back to the present now. Back to the cold coffee and the purple dawn, back to the beech tree and its hypnotic dance. Abigail leaves her mug on the kitchen counter and shuffles lazily across the linoleum floor until she reaches the front door. She grabs hold of its brass knob, jerks it open, and just like that, she's standing on the porch. The very same porch her mother had been standing on when the sheriff delivered that awful news 27 years prior. She glances upward. The sky above Old Man Gracie's cornfield will soon begin to redden. Then a deep orange sun will rise up over the stalks. The sight is a familiar one to her. She's watched it many times before. Just a few weeks ago, she stood with her husband, Mike, as the two of them enjoyed the sunrise together. A shallow breath slips between her lips, with it a fleeting feeling of loneliness. She wishes Mike was beside her now. Abigail closes her eyes. She can almost feel the weight of his arms draped around her shoulders, almost feel the coarseness of his beard rubbing against her cheek. And for a moment, she isn't alone anymore. Just a moment, though, because as soon as she opens her eyes again, his presence vanishes into the air like a dream. She looks down to find her fingers involuntarily caressing her abdomen. She wishes they could be his. Abigail descends the porch's wooden steps one by one so as to not trip. A tiny voice inside her head is warning her to be careful. Maybe it's her guardian angel. Maybe that tiny voice is me. Whoever the voice belongs to, it cautions her to tread lightly because today, the world is more treacherous than usual. The early morning air is cold. It has teeth, which it uses to nip at her bare shoulders relentlessly. She is wearing a thin pajama top with no bra, flannel bottoms, and a pair of cross trainers with no socks. They're Asics, not that it matters. For a brief moment, she considers going back inside to throw on a sweatshirt, but decides against it. The cold is of little importance to her. She doesn't know it, but in a few minutes, the weather will be the furthest thing from her mind. In fact, she's already running out of cares to give about it. Her thoughts are taking her off to the past again. We should follow her there. I wouldn't want you to miss this part of the story. The newspapers had dubbed Brady the Pike County Vampire after his arrest, on account of him devouring the hearts of two of his victims. A 7-year-old boy he had picked up on his way home from school the day he went missing, and an old woman who lived alone. Just 3 miles down the road from Abigail's house. Brady had been in the process of opening the chest of his third victim, a mentally handicapped gas station attendant named Bert, inside the garage of a pump and save off the side of Route 106, when a customer and mechanic walked in on the scene and subdued him long enough to call the police. He had bludgeoned the young man in the head 6 times with the back end of a claw hammer, shattering half his skull like an eggshell. He then drove the claw end of the hammer again and again into poor Bert's chest in an attempt to pry it open. Bert somehow remained conscious throughout the ordeal, which meant he most likely felt every single heinous thing Abigail's brother had done to him. Brady bit off his penis, too. On a surprising note, that detail wouldn't be mentioned much in the media firestorm that followed, but the world was a different place back then. Wilson Phillips was coming off a #1 hit, and the internet came on floppy disks, so you get the point. They say poor Bert was still alive by the time paramedics arrived, though he would expire shortly after, when his heart didn't just stop, but exploded in his chest from the trauma of multiple claw hammer blows. His scream could be heard up to 2 miles away, the final tortured cry of a dying, dickless simpleton. Abigail was too young to read the papers at the time, but she would learn later that the press had been calling for Brady's head during the trial. His lawyer tried to use the demented nature of his killings as an excuse to plead insanity, but Brady sabotaged the plan quickly. He boasted about his crimes to any reporter that put a microphone in front of his face and smiled at every camera they pointed in his direction. He laughed when his sins were read off by the prosecuting attorney and spat at the victims' families when he saw them in the courtroom. Brady would be sentenced to death in a trial that couldn't end fast enough. After the judgment came down, Abigail's mother stayed in bed for 3 days. During this time, little Abigail survived on a diet of Fruit Loops and goldfish crackers. Back then, when all this was happening, the weeds that grew in front of her home were as tall as Abigail was. They swallowed her whole. They felt as thick as the Amazon. She could get lost in them. Now, in the present, they only reach as high as her hip. She leans down and plucks a blade of grass from the earth. Abigail gazes at it in the same dreamy way she gazed at the tree. The moment feels both short and infinite. Eventually, she drops the blade of grass and it flutters casually down to her feet where it gets lost in a thicket of weeds. Abigail looks back up to the beech tree, studying its strong, sturdy base and thick branches, its green, bushy leaves as they wave to and fro. They go whoosh, whoosh, whoosh against the purple sky, and we go whoosh, whoosh, whoosh back into her memories, or whatever kind of sound that would make. After the trial, Brady decided that he wanted nothing to do with Abigail and her mother. He refused visitations and never answered calls from the house. I suppose it's true when they say absence makes the heart grow fonder, because as she aged, Abigail started to long for a relationship between Brady and herself. After all, he was her only brother. Even if he was on death row, she thought that maybe, just maybe, she could get to know him before he was gone forever. And so, at the tender age of 10, Abigail tried her hand at writing her brother a letter. This is what it said. "Dear Brady, I'm writing you because I want you to know that I love you. You're my brother and I'm your sister, and you are very missed here at home. Mama still talks about you every day. She wishes very badly you would let her see you sometime. I would like to see you too. Brothers and sisters shouldn't be strangers. Love, Abigail." 2 weeks later, when Abigail was fetching the mail, she saw an envelope addressed to her, postmarked Michigan City, Indiana. It had come from Indiana State Prison, where Brady had been incarcerated. Her brother had written her back. She snatched the letter to her chest and hurried inside. Abigail hadn't told her mother she had written to Brady. She had wanted it to be a surprise if he responded, and he had responded. Maybe now she and Brady could finally reconnect, and possibly Mama too. She ran to her room and shut the door behind her, fastened the lock, then jumped into bed and tore the envelope open. Inside was a single piece of notebook paper with a short message scribbled on it in pencil. The letter was authentic. She recognized Brady's handwriting instantly. Abigail studied her brother's words with hungry eyes. They were brief but to the point, and this is what they said. "You little brat, if I ever get out of here, I'll kill you, then defile your corpse. Brady." Okay, follow me back to the present now. Abigail is already there. We should catch up with her. She is no longer in the front yard. Abigail is following the wooden picket fence that runs along the side of her house. Mike had put it up. Now he's gone, and all she has left is a goddamn fence. She wishes she could swap the fence for Mike. She thinks about how she would tear it down with her bare hands, splinters be damned, if it meant bringing her husband back from the dead. But alas, life is cruel, and we can't trade fences for loved ones. If we could, it's safe to say the world would know no borders. She thought she knew then why he killed himself, but she didn't want to admit it at the time. She is starting to admit it now. Just starting, though. The idea still seems too absurd. Abigail hasn't bought into it quite yet. We have time to travel back to the past again before she does. She won't mind if we leave her for a bit. She won't even notice we're gone. Abigail never told her mother about Brady's letter. She believed it might break her heart if she did. She hadn't been lying when she had said that Mama talked about him every day. In fact, her mother regularly lamented about his detention and often blamed herself for Brady's evils. "If only I had been better to him," she would say. "If only I hadn't let his father walk out the door. All he needed was a man's hand to guide him." Abigail's mother used this guilt to fuel her fight against the court that had sentenced Brady to death. It didn't matter what it cost her, and it cost her quite a bit, thousands upon thousands of dollars. She was going to push back against the hand of justice and do everything in her power to see her son eventually set free. Even on the eve of Brady's execution, she was on the phone with his attorney, doing whatever she could to delay the lethal injection that was scheduled to take place. Her letters, the phone calls, and especially all the money would be in vain, though. And one warm November evening, 4 years after his notorious murder spree, Abigail's brother would have sodium thiopental, then pancuronium bromide, then finally potassium chloride injected into his bloodstream. He would die within minutes. Now, Brady may be long dead, but here in the presence, Abigail is very much alive. She's standing in the backyard, staring at the garden shed. It's not much to look at, honestly, just your average run-of-the-mill, all-weather garden shed. Probably purchased at Lowe's or Home Depot or an Orchid Supply Hardware. It doesn't really matter where. Its origin isn't pertinent to the story. What is pertinent is what's in that shed, or at least what Abigail hopes is in it. She steps carefully toward it. No longer is her mind swimming in a dreamlike wonder. No, Abigail's focus is sharp as a tack, despite the old memories that are roaring through her consciousness. We won't visit those memories quite yet. We'll stay with her just a little while longer. She opens the door of the shed and steps inside. Darkness swallows her. The air is stale. It smells of mildew and gasoline. Her hand searches clumsily for a chain hanging down from the ceiling. After a few frustrating moments, her fingers finally locate it, and she gives the chain a tug. A light bulb above her head flickers on, replacing the darkness with a dim yellow glow. She glances around. The place hasn't been straightened in a very long time. She bumbles and fumbles her way about, stepping over rusty lawnmowers and neglected weed whackers, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the light. It takes longer than she expected to find what she came looking for, but eventually she sees it, leaning inconspicuously in the corner, hiding behind 2 garden hoses, a rake, and a pair of pruning shears. The handle of an axe. Okay, we can go visit those memories now. The funeral director suggested to Abigail's mother that cremation would be the best option for Brady. One reason for this suggestion was his notorious reputation. There was a good chance Brady's grave could be desecrated if someone were to find out where he was buried. Besides, no cemetery within 100 miles wanted to house his wretched corpse anyway. It seemed like sound enough reasoning, so Mama asked him for a catalog in order to pick out a decorative urn. The funeral director, however, had another idea. 6 months prior, he had invested in a company called EcoUrn. The business sold biodegradable urns that used your loved one's ashes to help give sustenance to the seedling of a tree, and you could watch the plant grow. Death begets life. Or something of that nature, was the company's tagline, not that it matters. What does matter is that the funeral director pitched EcoUrn to Abigail's mother, and the idea struck a chord with her. She purchased one, filled it with her dead son's ashes, planted the seedling of a beech tree in the front yard of her home, and by the spring a tiny sapling had sprouted. The American beech has among the slowest growth rate of trees in the U.S., but after a year, the sapling had grown taller than the weeds that Abigail used to play in. After 2 years, it had risen above Mr. Gracie's cornfield, and its branches were sturdy enough to support her weight. A dendrologist is a botanist that studies trees. If one of these scientists had been monitoring the growth of this beech, he or she may have been able to explain to Abigail and her mother just how peculiar this rapid development had been. Unfortunately, dendrologists don't just grow on trees, and since they had no such experts to enlighten them on the phenomenon taking place in their front yard, the strange occurrence went unnoticed. Time passed, lots and lots. I don't want to bore you with the details, so here's an abridged account. Abigail got older, went to college in Chicago, met Mike, fell in love, graduated school, got married, settled down in the city, and through it all, the tree grew and grew and grew. In all those years she lived away from home, Brady and his shameful past felt as far off and distant as Halley's Comet soaring through the vast emptiness of space. But here's the thing about that icy space rock. Every so often, it swings back around and makes itself known to the world again. One day, Abigail received a phone call from the Pike County Sheriff's Office. Old Man Gracie had been tilling his cornfield when he noticed something hanging from the beech tree that had been planted in Brady's ashes. The tree was much taller now, 25 feet if it was an inch, and just as thick and sturdy ever. It turned out, the something Old Man Gracie had seen hanging in the tree was in fact a someone. Abigail's mother, to be exact. She had done the deed before the sun had risen. Mama's suicide had come as a great shock to Abigail. She had spoken to her on the phone just the day before, and everything had seemed fine, aside from the recent bout of nightmares that she had briefly complained about. After she got the news, Abigail and her husband headed back to Indiana to handle her mother's affairs, and 7 months later they still hadn't left. They decided that they liked the quiet country life of Pike County, and had decided they might even like to raise a family in Abigail's childhood home. This became their plan, until Mike's untimely death, of course. It was just a few mornings ago when Abigail found him hanging from a branch of the beech tree, noose around his neck, eyes devoid of life, body devoid of soul. He was swinging back and forth like a pendulum. The cornstalks in Old Man Gracie's field seemed to sway in sync with his body. They went whoosh, 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 together in harmony. Just the day before, he had been complaining of the same nightmares Mom had been having. Abigail's brother talking to him in his dreams, whispering awful things into his ear, urging him to hurt himself. Now, Abigail is having those nightmares too. In these dreams, she's a child again, hiding amongst the tall grass in the front yard. Brady is there. He stands where the beech tree should be. In his hands is a rope. He holds it up high above the tall grass so she can watch as he ties it into a noose, each step slow and deliberate, each step burned into her mind. When he speaks, he makes sure to remind Abigail just how lonely she is, how she'll never know happiness again now that her husband is gone. He blames Abigail for her mother's death, shames her for moving away, and insists that death is the only way she'll ever be at peace with herself. Perhaps what terrifies Abigail most about these nightmares is that a part of her believes what her brother says. She didn't need Brady to make her feel guilty over leaving her mother behind for a life in the city, and Mike's death has left a gaping hole in her heart. Now those feelings are magnified tenfold. Even minutes after waking, she feels a strong compulsion to tie a noose around her neck and throw herself from one of the beech tree's branches. So there you have it. We're all caught up. It's time to go back to the present again. We'll stay here until the end of the story. Abigail is standing in the front yard, axe in hand. The sky is crimson red now. It looks as though heaven has caught fire. Her focus rests solely on the beech tree. Its branches are still swaying to and fro, still going whoosh, whoosh, whoosh in the early morning light. Just the tree, though. The tall grass in the front yard remains still. So are the stalks rising up from Mr. Gracie's cornfield. There's not a hint of wind in the air, no breeze, no gust, no gale influencing the beech tree's branches. Yet still, it waves its arms as though it has a mind of its own. She knows now why her mother killed herself and why Mike had done the same. Somehow, Brady's spirit never left this plane of existence. Somehow it survives through the tree, where it has been burgeoning, flourishing, building its strength, waiting for the right time to unleash its vile self on the world again. That time is now. The wooden behemoth's arms coil and twist in the most unnatural of ways. The manner in which they move makes them resemble the tentacles of a massive squid rather than branches of a tree. Its trunk is still firmly rooted to the ground, but an appalling notion flashes through Abigail's mind. It's just images, really, little glimpses into a what-if scenario Abigail doesn't want to imagine could be possible. The tree's roots pulling themselves free from the earth, slithering across the front yard like some unholy eldritch horror, wrapping themselves around her throat, strangling her, then defiling her corpse just as Brady had promised to do in his letter. She doesn't know if her brother actually has the ability to do that with his new body, but just the idea is enough to horrify her. The tree is twisting itself into knots now, performing its vulgar dance for Abigail. She is its audience, the yard its theater, the bleeding sky its backdrop, like the red velvet curtains of a stage. Abigail paces cautiously towards the tree. A branch swoops down towards her. She ducks under it, but the branch grazes her right shoulder, and she knows Brady isn't going to just wait for her to hang herself. Another branch sweeps over her head. She darts forward, and it misses her entirely. Now she's close enough to the trunk to reach out and touch it with her hand. Both of the tree's attempts at her have been clumsy, and she realizes that Brady does not have as much control over the beach as she thought that he did. She reasons that his soul has only just fully manifested, like a child learning to walk. It may take time for him to master his wooden form. Her brother has overestimated himself. He showed his hand before he was ready, and now she has a chance to end him before he can end her. But she needs to be careful because there's no telling if the monster is hiding an ace up his sleeve. Abigail grips the axe tight, rears back, and takes a mighty swing. Splinters fly through the air when the edge of the blade buries itself into the trunk. The impact sends a shockwave up Abigail's arm and into her shoulders and neck. The branches above her head shake furiously after the blow. Its leaves flutter like a million green butterflies. They sound as if they're hissing. When she pulls the axe back, she can see something dark seeping down the base of its trunk. It's as red as the sky and doesn't ooze like sap. The bitter smell of copper now permeates the air so thick she can taste it. The tree is bleeding. Abigail swings the axe again, and once more the tree cries out in agony. The blade has sunk deeper this time. The inner layers of the tree feel softer than she was expecting, spongy almost. With any luck, it might go down easier than she anticipated. She pulls the axe back and readies herself to swing again. But before she can, a heavy branch swoops down and strikes her thigh. She stumbles, but gathers her footing and collects herself. She isn't hurt. If Brady had more command over the beach, he might have been able to target her head. Still, there's always the chance he could get lucky on his next try, so she decides to take away his weapons before he can do any real damage. Abigail hacks away at the lower hanging branches, lopping them off one by one. Each time she takes an arm from the beach, its remaining branches tremble, and she hears the repulsive hiss of its leaves pulsating in pain. The sound gives her pleasure. Blood drains from the stumps where the branches used to be, trickling into scarlet puddles somewhere below the tall grass. Just like with the trunk, the center of the branches are softer and spongier than wood. Her axe wears the tree's blood across its steel face like war paint, and her pajamas are smeared with deep red stains. Abigail has hacked off as many as 6 arms before she decides to turn her attention back towards the trunk. She is not scared anymore, but she knows Brady is. She swings the axe repeatedly towards the core of the tree, aiming for the wound she had opened up earlier. Blisters are forming on the palms of her hands, her heart is pounding inside her chest, her lungs are burning from fatigue, but every time she feels like she needs to stop and take a break, she remembers those her brother hurt. Mike, her mother, poor, simple Bert, the old woman who lived down the way, a little boy walking home from school one sunny September afternoon. She remembers these people, and it motivates her to swing the axe harder, swing it faster, kill the monster once and for all, erase him from this world before he can hurt anyone else. It takes her nearly 25 minutes of chopping before she decides the tree is ready to topple. Abigail drops the axe, puts 2 hands against the trunk of the beech, and pushes with every ounce of energy she has left. A loud crackle fills the air as what's left of the trunk begins to bend and snap. The beech's leaves flutter feverishly as it starts to lean. Then, almost all at once, it comes crashing down, 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 landing in the road that separates Abigail's yard from Old Man Gracie's cornfield. She watches as the tree goes into its death throes. Its branches writhe across the ground like angry snakes. Blood gushes from the spongy center of the stump, and leaves flap back and forth as though they're trying to break free and fly away. But after a minute or so, the tree's hiss begins to hush, and the thrashing begins to end. Brady is gone. This time, for good. There is no major feeling of accomplishment that watches over Abigail, only relief that her brother has finally been dealt with once and for all. The sun has begun to peek out over the top of the cornfield, and the sky has taken on a light pink hue. Abigail turns and stumbles slowly toward the house. She stops when she reaches the porch and looks back at the beech lying dead in the middle of the road. In a few hours, once businesses open up, she will call a service to have it removed. Someone who will make firewood out of it, or maybe grind it into pulp. Someone who won't ask too many questions about its spongy, bloody core. "It's a fungus," she will say if anyone is curious. "Damn thing was rotten from the inside out." After she takes care of the tree, she plans to drive down to the pharmacy to pick up a pregnancy test, though she's certain she already knows what it'll say. Abigail places her hand to her stomach. Mike may be gone, but it turns out he left her something other than the fence after all. She will not be looking back anymore. She is leaving her memories, all of the good, all of the bad, in the past where they belong. She has a future to look towards now, because soon there will be a new addition to the family tree.